So back to today. The first speaker will be Andrew Clement from Canada.
Well, thank you, Mikkel, and thank you, Irina. Thank you for coming. It's a delight and an honor for me to be able to present to you. This is an interesting event for me as it's framed as having to do with crypto. And while I think cryptographic techniques play an important part in addressing questions of surveillance and privacy, what I'm going to talk to you about today poses the problem in larger terms, of which crypto is an important part, but there are a lot of other things that I hope you will consider doing about mass state surveillance, of challenging it effectively. I'm going to talk mainly about kinds of forms of transparency that can help make the agencies, the companies that conduct surveillance on all of us more accountable, more compliant with our laws and constitutions. And I think all of you have a role to play in that because you're directly affected and your future is implicated in the ways in which our institutions deal with the challenge of mass state surveillance. I'm from the University of Toronto, and I've been doing research over the last few years looking at the ways in which our internet traffic has been intercepted. And this image here, well, I'll come back to that later, is of the Internet Switching Center in San Francisco that we know is the site, one of the sites that the National Security Agency has installed its splitter operation so that it can intercept the traffic, all the traffic that's basically going in and out of that building. And you have buildings and fiber optic cables here in Europe where similar things are going to be done. And so what I want to do is to give you an idea of what is the nature of the problem that this sort of interception plays. I will then sort of identify a bit more specifically who the actors are, at least what we know from the Snowden revelations, and what the problem is. I mean, there are many problems here that we need to address, and I'll suggest some ways that we might go about doing that. So first of all, what is mass internet surveillance? The National Security Agency and its partners in the Five Eyes Signal Intelligence Alliance, that's the 5 countries of the US, my own, sadly, Canada, UK, New Zealand, and Australia. So the Anglo world has put together an alliance to basically snoop on everybody else. I'm sure they're not alone in doing that, but we know much more about what they're doing than the other actors. But hopefully we can find out more about that. So they've helpfully provided some slides to their own analysts. This is perhaps the best overview. There are 2 forms of surveillance that they conduct systematically and in massive detail. One is called upstream programs. These are programs that intercept your internet traffic on the fly. As it's whizzing through these fiber optic cables at 10 gigabits per second, they make copies of that and analyze it, store it, and take various actions as they consider appropriate. The other kind of surveillance it goes under the name of this PRISM program. How many of you have heard of PRISM? Just to get an idea. So about a third of you. Okay, good. Well, the PRISM program is their partnership arrangements with the major tech companies to access your data when it is at rest. But I'm going to be talking mainly about it as it's on the fly. What sort of information do they collect? Well, everything pretty much. These are the sorts of things that they have access to, that they're interested in. Their motto has been, for the last decade or so, collect it all. And they are collecting it in a multitude of ways around the globe. This is their cryptologic platform, as they call it, and this outlines the various ways in which they capture communications on the fly, so to speak, around the world. It doesn't include the PRISM program, but this is where they tap into submarine cables, into switching centers, to satellites. They do it through a series of liaisons with various countries, 30 of them. They make arrangements with over 80 carriers. They then use this to put in more implants into routers and switches and other machines so they can intercept more, and so on. One just brief snapshot of the data that they collect. This is from March 2013. This is 1 month. And this is indicating the amount of data that they're collecting. So the total on here is 97 billion items of data, and this is sort of the heat map of where they're collecting it around the world. That the reports from the Snowden documents identify 23 million telephone metadata records. That's the who called whom when that were captured in Denmark alone. Who does this? We've heard of the NSA, the National Security Agency. It has Five Eyes partners, Canada, US, and so on. But they do it with other partner organizations or partner countries around the world. There are 30 of them, and Denmark is a partner with the NSA in some aspects of its collection and data sharing arrangements, as I've just suggested. Then there are the companies. The companies in the PRISM program were the first to be identified in the Snowden revelations, the published documents starting in June 2013. Uncharacteristically, they did not provide code names for these, so we know them in plain. So Microsoft started in 2007, and I would guess that there's no one here in this room who doesn't have a fair amount of data with at least one of these organizations. Google and Facebook would be the top of my list of guesses. So they claim that they have direct access to those servers. Now that's been disputed, and what's direct mean and so on, but there's no question that they have made arrangements to get that data. So those are the corporate partners for the data at rest. For their partners, and they keep using that term, partners, whether it's coerced or willing, and some of them are definitely willing, include the biggest telecom companies in the world. We first knew about AT&T back in 2006, that switching center that I mentioned a moment ago. But it turns out that there are as the other side says, there are 80 at least around the world, and we're trying to figure out which ones they are by their code names, because they're all known by code names, but through various means, journalists are being able to decipher them. So some of you might recognize these. Some are the carriers behind the scenes that carry the long-haul traffic between continents and so on. And they're actually the biggest carriers, like Level 3 and Cogent and so on. They almost certainly cooperate in various ways with the NSA to make sure that the data is intercepted. Now, what is the problem with this? I don't think anyone would question that there aren't serious problems, but the first one that comes most to mind, and which, well, I should say problems, the first one that comes to mind, of course, is personal privacy. This is the issue that is always raised. When somebody can snoop in your data, have a look at it, particularly when they're doing that illegally, unconstitutionally, as has been shown, without your knowledge, your personal privacy feels offended. But there are many other risks and concerns that this form of mass surveillance raises. Obvious ones are freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. If they know that you are meeting with certain people, that you are discussing certain topics that may not be in favor, then you could become a person of interest they then can make selectors on you, and they can follow you and develop a dossier on you. And this is certainly what's happening. Even if you have not done anything illegally, if you become a person of interest for whatever reason, then the data on you can relatively easily be kept. Now, when you raise these issues about rights being challenged or being undermined, the response is often, well, if we want security from terrorist attacks usually, then we have to give up a few of those rights. And I would just say at this point, we need to challenge that assumption on various grounds. Most immediately is, what security are these surveillance means providing us? And there's very little evidence, almost no evidence, that they contribute in any way, for all the billions of dollars that have been spent on them, to protecting against particularly terrorist attacks. They serve a much wider purpose, I would say, and there's evidence of this for much more routine matters of law enforcement in the United States. The FBI, tobacco and drug, I forget the acronym, but they're using them for intercepting around drug deals that's being used in international trade relations and so on. So there's a wide range of uses of this data, and I would argue that's much more the incentive for this, for the development of these programs, and the anti-terrorism argument is for public consumption. But there are other problems. This gentleman, Richard Clarke, who was, as it says here, the cyber czar, he was advisor to 5 US presidents, and he identified the creation of such an infrastructure, an apparatus of surveillance that's embedded within our communication systems as a dangerous move. He's not opposed to the NSA. I mean, he's a supporter of the NSA, but he alerts us that we have put into place the mechanisms, the techniques to create a ubiquitous, omniscient police surveillance state. Now, these are alarming terms, but he repeats this several times in a particular talk a couple of years ago, and observes that once you have such a surveillance state, police surveillance state, it's very difficult to turn off. How do you oppose it, right? Who can do that without fear? And then you have these gentlemen, the former head of the NSA, Keith Alexander, the current and longtime head of National Intelligence, James Clapper, and they testified to the U.S. Senate a few years ago, actually a couple of months before Snowden's revelations, and Clapper was asked directly by Ron Wyden, a senator who is on the Security Intelligence Committee and had been briefed into these programs. So he knew that they were going on. So he can't speak about it though, so he asked Clapper, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans? And Clapper's infamous response, looking extremely uncomfortable, says, "No, sir, not intentionally." And when Snowden released his documents and showed that they knew down to the last byte how much data they were collecting on Americans and everybody else around the world, his response when challenged on this was to say that was the least untruthful thing I could say at the time. Now, we would normally expect that when people with such positions of power and responsibility make false claims to the parliament or parliamentary bodies, they need to resign. That's a very serious offense. In the case of Clapper, President Obama said, well, he was trying to do his job and it's okay. Now, that to me is a signal of another much deeper problem. Not just that you have the mechanisms of a police state, but that you have an apparatus that can act with impunity. They can lie in public and get away with it. So what is going to ever bring them to account? So that's the problem, or that's one of the key problems that I see we need to address in mass surveillance. in dealing with mass surveillance. If we accept the conditions now, if we accept that they've bolted in, wired in, plugged in a surveillance apparatus into our communication systems that we depend on daily, and we do nothing about it, then that has to be accepted, as much as the sun shines and the waters flow. That will be a fact of our contemporary life. So how do we unwind that? Well, we are all participants in that. We are creating through our activities the internet and the communication systems that they depend on. And so how we respond is going to be vital. I see a question here. Well, Obama's statement, of course, has no legal power. When the first revelations about the AT&T's interception was in San Francisco, this is back in 2006 when that was revealed, there were over 40 court cases, some against AT&T and some against the government, that were introduced, or taken to court. None of those have proceeded. The ones against the company, AT&T, were stymied by what's known as the FISA Amendments Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which in 2008 rendered those companies to be immune from prosecution. That was signed by President Bush, but then Senator Obama came off the campaign trail to vote for that in the Senate. The cases against the government have been stymied almost entirely, and you can see an example of this in the film Citizen 4, by the government arguing that to hold the case would be a challenge to state security, and so could not proceed. So that's another example, I would say, of the way in which this sort of security state within the wider state has basically rendered itself immune from prosecution, so it can act with impunity. So it's going to need much more than just somebody taking it to court or taking the government or the agencies to court to unwind that. That's at least in the United States. Now, there has been some movement in the United States to withdraw some of and amend some of the parts of the Patriot Act, which was one of the provisions under which this was collected. But it's a relatively minor move. It moves the storage of the data basically from the government to the telecom companies, but they have to keep it until the government asks for it. But all of the other forms of surveillance are basically proceeding as is under the current legal regime. And there's very good grounds for questioning whether that is constitutional or not, but we haven't been able to actually take those cases. So that's, to me, kind of the scope of the problem. Maybe rather depressing, and it may seem hopeless, but as I say, you got to do something about it. Another concern is what then, further to that, if you have such an apparatus, what if this gentleman, at this point it might be surprising if he wins in November, but he has pointed repeatedly that the system is broken. He gives his evidence, his own ability to manipulate it to his ends, but he's got a point there. But from what he said, he has come out in support of unconstitutional acts like torture, stop and frisk, and a number of other measures. So when you have an apparatus that is subject to political whim, as we've seen, and potentially much worse, and the U.S. isn't the only country to get leaders who sort of act in such a manner as Trump is doing, then we're in trouble. So it's much better we don't leave these kinds of apparatuses around so that they can be hijacked even if they have good reasons or some basis for their creation. It's very dangerous. So what I see is the problem here, and this was very clearly enunciated by Laura Poitras, who made the film Citizen 4, which documents Snowden's release process. these disclosures revealed they don't only expose a threat to our privacy, but to our democracy itself. Those are the remarks she made when she accepted the Oscar. And I think that is a key point. So when you look at measures such as encryption or obfuscation and all these number of others, you have to ask the question, well, first of all, do they actually protect your privacy? And that's a fraught question, and it's not always obvious that it does. But also, what does that mean in terms of the democratic processes and institutions? Do those measures help those, or do they set them back? And I'd like you to think about that, and I'll say a few more words about it. But the question broadly is, what can we do about it? Not so easy, but I think we need to do what we can. Snowden points out a rather obvious point, but something that I think often gets lost, is that there are policy responses as well as technological responses. We have to do them both, and they have to be in concert with each other. And so my orientation is more on the policy front. How can we help those who are in a position to influence the laws, the other systems of accountability? And the approach that I've tried to take can be called sort of counter surveillance, looking back at those who are conducting the surveillance and try to make it more visible. It's not a solution by any means. It has some difficulties, and as I said, if we know everything about them and we do nothing, if we understand how they're surveilling us and that they're acting illegally, and then we do nothing, then we've actually helped them along. But at least as a first step, what I've tried to do is to make the forms of surveillance that we're subject to much more visible. And I've done this through a mapping project that aims to show you where your traffic goes across the internet. It's not a cloud. It's not some sort of ethereal space where there are no boundaries. You put your packets in and they magically appear where you want them to do. The internet is constituted through relatively few large internet switching centers, mainly at the center of large cities, and they're connected by fiber optic cables, and so it's a very material infrastructure with relatively few sort of critical choke points. And this is one of them. This is the Folsom Street Switching Center in San Francisco. And then we try to help you see where your data goes. And I'm not going to go into the detail there, but through a crowdsourcing process, we encourage people to submit their own data, their own trace routes, so that you can tell where your data goes and map it and how that aligns, at least with the sites that we suspect to have NSA surveillance. We've also developed an archive of these Snowden documents, so if you want to, it's another form of making it visible. If you were to try and to do research on the Snowden documents, you have to go to each of the individual websites of the various media outlets, and then dig them up, and they may not last forever. So we're trying to produce a searchable, permanent, definitive collection of these documents. And so you can go to the Snowden archive and you can look this stuff up yourself. We tried to make it easier. Then let's look at the technical responses. And I say that's technical and also political at the same time, because you're making a statement by the adoption of them. And I'm not going to say much about encryption. You've got a person who's much more competent to speak about them myself, but I do encourage you to think about how you can use these tools, but also to recognize that while you're protecting yourself and maybe protecting others through privacy, they don't necessarily undermine the well, they don't necessarily help the democratic institutions if what it does is it allows these surveillance agencies to argue, as they do, well, we're finding it harder to look at people's data, give us a bigger budget so that we can invest in quantum crypto cracking devices or put more implants so that we can get around the encryption and so on. It creates an arms race. So that alone, I would say, is not going to get you there. But I'd be happy to debate this later in the public session. How's my time doing? Am I 2 minutes? What? 10 minutes? Oh, really? Okay. So what else can you do? Well, one of the things that you can do those of you at university or whatever organization you can do is to keep your email out of the hands of some of these PRISM companies, notably Microsoft and Google, which are going around the world trying to sew up the market for email services. At the ITU here, who's your internet service provider for mail, anyway? Microsoft, okay. Right, and where's your data stored? Ireland, ostensibly, yes. And Microsoft is known for its mirroring, as many of these other cloud companies do, around the world in terms of their backup for good technical reasons. So you don't really know, I would say, where your data is. It's likely in multiple jurisdictions, and it is subject to the laws in those jurisdictions. This was a problem for us in Canada, and we were able to hold our university off from its planned move to Microsoft Cloud service for our email. I don't know how long it's going to last, but we've held them off for 2 years, and we'll see how it goes. But your universities should be able to, particularly if they do this collectively, support and manage their own email services. You don't need Microsoft and Google to do this for you, even though they dangle such nice things like their Google apps in front of you and claim that all students have gone to Google anyway. So what's the point of holding on? Make that something that a university or other institutions are accountable for. Part of the problem is that it's not clear when you send an email who the provider is and where your data goes. So try to look into that. And what we're trying to do in Canada is to stop what we call boomerang routing, where a lot of our domestic traffic, over a quarter of our domestic traffic, even from one city to the same city, goes to the United States. That doesn't make sense. So try to look at where your traffic goes, and you can use our XMaps program to see whether your routing is going via the US, or here, it's more likely that it's going via London or somewhere in the UK, where the GCHQ, their intelligence agency, has the same powers, actually more powers legally than the NSA, and is very active in interception. But there's also some more sort of professional policy steps you can take. This has been, to varying degrees, an active discussion amongst IT professional groups. I was at PROSA on Friday, and I was very impressed by the degree to which the PROSA members were interested in this issue and are already well active in trying to draw attention to the issue of surveillance of internet traffic. One of the staff there said he spent 10% of his time on this issue alone, and this is impressive. So these such professional organizations can help in this. We've also developed transparency reporting tools so that the companies that handle our data are proactively reporting on how they handle it in ways that are relevant to this issue of surveillance, such as what do they do when the police, law enforcement, security agencies come knocking and want their data. Up until recently, that's been a black hole. We've known very little about that. Now they're beginning to report. It hasn't gone very far yet. They'll report numbers, and they don't report enough about the details. But they're also beginning to report the criteria under which they will respond to those requests. What does the government or the law enforcement agency need to provide in terms of documentation and legal authority before they get your data? In Canada, they were recently the internet carriers, the telecom companies, were routinely handing over that data without those forms of authorization. So this is another thing that you might do. And also, there are civil liberties groups. I know them better in North America, but who are very active in this campaign and very thinly resourced and could do with any help that you can give them. So these are some of the other ways in which we can address this question of the problems with mass state surveillance as a bundle, a toxic bundle of challenges that include direct challenge to the democratic institutions in which we depend on and which need to be supported. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to questions and the discussion afterwards. And good luck. Thank you.